Good afternoon. I am Deborah McDowell, the current and soon to be outgoing director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute. And I welcome you this afternoon to this exciting book discussion of Jarvis Givens's very, very exciting book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson, and the Art of Black Teaching. We are honored to be hosting this event and to have such distinguished panelists with us. Professor Givens will give us a brief overview of the book, followed by comments from our panelists. So I will first introduce him, and after his remarks, the other panelists. Jarvis Givens is an assistant professor of education and African American studies at Harvard University, and he is currently a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. When I was there, it was called the Bunting Institute. But that was in the antediluvian era. Professor Givens specializes in the history of African American education, and his first book, the focus of our discussion this afternoon, is Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, published this year by Harvard University Press. His research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the William F. Milton Fund, and published in peer-reviewed journals such as the American Education Research Journal, Souls, Harvard Educational Review, and Race, Ethnicity, and Education. Professor Givens earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. I want to remind you that you will find in the chat information about ordering the book, and we strongly encourage you to do so, which is available via discount from Harvard University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jarvis Givens.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Professor McDowell, for that introduction and for everything you've done to coordinate this event and for inviting me to share this new book on Carter G. Woodson and the history of Black teachers and all that they contributed to so much that we've inherited and continue to benefit from today. It's great to be giving this talk at the Woodson Institute. I've long wanted to figure out some way to be affiliated or to find a way to share my work with the Woodson Institute. So what better way to kind of first do that than to discuss my book on Woodson, right? With the wonderful community of scholars that you all have at the University of Virginia at the Institute. So I want to make sure that I don't take up too much time, but I must say that I'm super, super excited to be in conversation with three scholars who have been super influential in terms of my own thinking about Woodson, but also the history of Black education. Professor Francio Wilson, Professor Derrick Alridge, and Professor Dagbovie, who have had a tremendous amount of influence on my thinking at various stages of this project, from the time I was a graduate student at Berkeley, working on my dissertation, to the process of revising the dissertation and trying to reimagine the project for the book that we're going to be discussing today. And so that being said, I'm going to share my screen so that I can begin. And the time that I'll take is under 20 minutes because I want to make sure that we get to conversation with the rest of the panelists today. So for the embattled reality of Black teachers and students, we have almost no language. Their history is not only a story of triumph, nor only one of defeat. The heritage of Black education requires the embrace of competing narratives, persecution, and resistance. While initially drawn to the subversive practices of Black teachers and their students, I found the language of resistance, or the challenging of power, to be accurate but insufficient. Scholars often focus on Black people's struggle to gain access to education, desegregation through courts, and exceptional narratives of educational achievement. This history of separate and unequal education is important. But while such narratives capture anti-Black persecution in the American school, they do very little to appreciate the art of Black teaching or Black educational strivings across generations. The everyday character of their resistance has largely gone unacknowledged. Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson, and the Art of Black Teaching is my attempt to offer a more balanced account. This effort has required new language to talk about the dynamic stories of Black education in the 19th century through Jim Crow. Fugitivity names more precisely the form that resistance takes in these contexts. Fugitivity is covert, concealed, hidden, planning and intentional strategy. What I call fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination, actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. To illuminate key aspects of fugitive pedagogy, I'd like to begin with the book's opening scenario. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The state's all-white Department of Education gave clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had very little control over curriculum. Yet, on many occasions, McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's, quote, book on the Negro, end quote, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary technologies and practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. Quote, she read to us from that book, one of McGee's students recounted. When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk and teach us from the outline. And when the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap, end quote. So for the remainder of my time, I want to look closely at two pieces of this scenario, the teacher and the textbook. I'll offer a short reading of Ms. McGee's efforts to escape the official curriculum by way of the hidden transcript literally resting on her lap, and how Woodson's textbook, The Negro in Our History, rendered a competing narrative of Black life that defied racist school policies and curricula. The teacher. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of fugitive pedagogy. Her concealed lesson plan rejected the degrading representations of Black life in official school curricula, and such refusals manifested in physical form. McGee's public display of the official outline was in fact a masked performance of complicity, an embodied text that accompanied the subversive and spoken content of her lesson. McGee's physical act of switching text also communicated important messages to her students, demonstrating how defiance could at times be disguised by public performances of deference to the coercive regime of school authorities. Teachers like McGee gained access to alternative scripts of knowledge through what the sociologist Alden Morris has called insurgent intellectual networks. Institutions like Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and colored teacher associations. Such organizations comprised a veiled yet networked world, one where Black Americans said one thing and did another. Given rampant anti-Black violence, the true political intentions undergirding Black educational strivings were rarely on full display. African Americans responded, often in quiet, calculated acts of resistance against oppressive school settings that reflected a world order built on their subjection. Fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as individual acts of practice. For example, the principal entering McGee's classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones, and records suggest that Jones supported the inclusion of Black history and culture in Webster Parish. He was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work. And as you can see by the documents on the screen, Woodson regularly appeared on programs at the annual meetings of colored teacher associations at both the state and at the national level. It is not implausible then to consider that Jones and McGee may have very likely conspired together, the principal testing the teacher to ensure she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the room. Wearing the mask, as Paul Laurence Dunbar called it, had long been part and parcel of Black teachers' professional disposition. In Black segregated schools, the intrusion of white surveillance had a hand in shaping school ecology. It was not atypical for white people to drop by unannounced during the school day, either to show off their Negro schools to visitors or for some routine inspection. Such visits were primarily meant to demonstrate power, which was essential to reproducing domination. This is to say, the person walking into McGee's classroom could just as easily have been a white school official. Black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts, because if they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. Just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, I should say, learned of Woodson's textbooks being used in the local Black high school there. Textbooks were confiscated, teachers were reprimanded, and the principal was threatened and forced to resign. After reading the textbook, the white school board quotes, quote, expressed horror and surprise that such a work should have crept into our Negro schools, end quote. They assured their white constituents that they will be more vigilant moving forward, stating, quote, we must not take in teachers who will create discord by teaching isms of any sort, end quote. And examples of this kind of violent oversight are plentiful, and they move forward and backwards in time as far as Black teachers are concerned. Black educators were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. Some notable examples of this, as displayed on the screen, are Ida B. Wells in Tennessee, John W. Davison in Georgia, Anna Julia Cooper in Washington, D.C., and of course, Septima Clark in South Carolina. And yet, there were those that lost more than their jobs. Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 and later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida. Black teachers' awareness of such stories prompted them at times to conceal their pedagogical objectives in the presence of intrusive white power. Subjection to surveillance and violence, motivated by no causal logics whatsoever, was a fact of Blackness. African-American educators developed strategies to contest this reality, which ranged from broad institutional realms down to the interpersonal and psychic levels. Fugitivity, in its historical reference, holds in place both the realities of constraint and Black Americans' constant straining against said confinement. It is careful not to overstate one or the other. As Fred Moten aptly notes, and I paraphrase, escape is an activity, it is not an achievement. The possible threat of recapture always lingered. Escape was unresolved and uncertain, and Black teachers carried an intimate knowledge of such precarity. The textbook. So my concern with the historical framings of Black education began with the textbook. I had come across a footnoted reference to one of Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, one of which you see pictured on the screen being read by a group of junior high students in the 1930s in New Orleans. You know, at that point, I was aware that Woodson had played a central role in African-American studies as the second African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1912, and as founder of Negro History Week in 1926, which we now celebrate, of course, as Black History Month. But I was shocked to learn about the size of his impact on educational practice during Jim Crow in the private spaces of Black teachers' classrooms. While most accounts emphasize Woodson's role as a historian, right, affectionately referring to him as the father of Black history, much less has been written about Woodson's 30-year career as a public school teacher and leader among educators. And yet, Woodson worked fervently from his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District in Washington, D.C. From this post, Woodson responded personally to letters written by individual teachers. Some wrote him with historical questions. Others inquired in hushed tones about strategically working to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers in schools across the country. They packaged Negro history kits by hand, and they shipped off decorative materials for teachers to refashion their classrooms. The wide circulation of his ideas and curriculum materials among Black teachers implied, at least for me, a much more complicated story than those suggested by pervasive images of dilapidated school buildings and the aggressive neglect of Black education that dominate public memory, and in large part, academic scholarship on the subject as well. And what intrigued me most about Woodson's textbooks, as well as those written by Black public school teachers before him, was the extensive commemoration of fugitive slaves and Black fugitive life. As early as 1890, Black educators wrote textbooks that were filled with heroic narratives about enslaved Blacks who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, stories of Black maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. But that's not all. The fugitive slave emerged as a folk hero and cultural symbol in curricula developed by these educators. The fugitive slave also appeared, for instance, in school naming practices and within commemorative ceremonies in school activities and rituals. I should point out that Carter G. Woodson graduated from the Frederick Douglass High School in Huntington, West Virginia. As a funny story, my high school teacher also graduated from a school in the South named after Douglass, but maybe we can get to that in the Q&A. But Black Americans, what we see, had established this heroic tradition around the stories and names associated with this pedagogy of escape. As a folk hero in Black curricular imaginations, the fugitive slave carried important insights about the interior life of teachers and students. It was this realization that prompted my reliance on the fugitive slave archetype and on fugitive pedagogy as a theory and practice of Black educational life in the United States. The term is much more than some elaborate metaphor. It names a phenomenon that surfaced within the archive at multiple levels. It indexes the embodied and intellectual acts of subversion that were central to Black educational strivings, while emphasizing how many of these acts transpired in secret. What's more, the concept draws a narrative line from the enslaved people's defiance of anti-literacy laws, which rendered Black education and criminality equal transgressions, to the actions of educators like Tessie McGee. It was also clarifying to learn that the very first Black authored textbooks were actually written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland, inaugurated this tradition in 1841. A textbook on the origins and history of the colored people represents the beginning of a formalized practice of Black people striving to rewrite the epistemological order. The fugitive slave William Wells Brown also wrote a textbook in 1863. So as the 19th century witnessed the proliferation of print culture Black Americans used these resources to nurse their liberatory dreams. Like newspapers, journals, and various other forms of Black print culture, textbooks became tools, not only of the master, but also of the fugitive slave. Such counter readings of the world carried over to Woodson's theorizing about Black education. In his iconic text, The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson wrote, quote, "Starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided that they would work out a program to enslave the Negro's mind inasmuch as the freedom of body had to be conceded," end quote. He suggested that the political conflicts at the core of Black education were fundamentally linked to the legacies and social technologies of enslavement. Here, Woodson anticipates, for instance, Saidiya Hartman's assertion that the linear progress narrative of slavery to freedom breaks down when we look at the material and socio-political conditions of Black life post-emancipation. So thinking with these scholars, my book, Fugitive Pedagogy, reconsiders Black education in the post-Civil War era as intimately situated in what Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, or what Woodson himself termed, quote, the sequel to slavery. In his first textbook, The Negro in Our History, Woodson offered the following, quote, "How some of these slaves learned in spite of opposition makes a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden, many slaves continued their education under adverse circumstances," end quote. Woodson named the entanglement of violent white opposition and the enslaved people's steady practice of learning as a means of escape, offering it as a generative lesson for students and educators during Jim Crow. Indeed, this was the origin story that framed what was politically at stake in their teaching and learning. This dialectic was the heritage of Black education. At its highest calling, Black education continued to be a stealing away from and refusal of the American school's official protocols and curricula. And I'll stop there because I'm excited to hear the comments from the folks who I'm sharing the virtual stage with today, and looking forward to the conversation we'll be able to have. But thank you for listening.
How exciting. Thank you so much. I am going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. And Professor Derrick Alridge has graciously agreed to navigate us through the Q&A. Let me introduce him, who will also offer his remarks regarding the book. Derrick P. Alridge is Professor of Education and an affiliate faculty member in the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, which is our great good fortune. An educational and intellectual historian, Alridge's work examines American education with foci in African American education and the Civil Rights Movement. He is the author of The Educational Thought of W.E.B. Du Bois, An Intellectual History, 2008, and co-editor with James B. Stewart and V.P. Franklin of Message in the Music, Hip Hop, History, and Pedagogy, 2011. He is currently writing The Hip Hop Mind, Ideas, History, and Social Consciousness, and is editor with Neil Bynum and James B. Stewart of the Black intellectual tradition in the United States in the 20th century, forthcoming from University of Illinois Press. He has published numerous articles in journals such as the History of Education Quarterly, the Journal of African American History, Teachers College Record, Educational Researcher, and the Journal of Negro Education. He is founder, director, and principal investigator of Teachers in the Movement, an oral history project, founding director of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, and principal investigator of the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site. Alridge is also a key part of the new initiative launched in the fall of 2018, designed to help teachers increase racial, religious, and ethnic inclusion in students from kindergarten to college. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alridge. I'll let you go first. Go ahead, Derrick.
All right. All right. Yeah. All right. So thank you, Professor McDowell and the Woodson Institute for sponsoring this event. I can't think of a better place for this book talk to take place than in the Woodson Institute. So this is great. I want to thank Professor Givens for his remarks on this outstanding book. Professor Givens noted that I was a mentor to him of sorts and that I influenced him in some way. Let me just say that he has definitely influenced me tremendously and that I admire him for all the scholarship that he's produced over the last few years. And I want to congratulate him on that. So let me just speak briefly, since I will serve as the moderator. I was impressed with this book because of many reasons. One was the extensive archival research that Professor Givens put into this work. I mean, I've been in conversations with Professor Givens for probably the last 3 or 4 years about this book. And I've had many conversations with him about the archives, about his ideas of fugitive pedagogy, but to see it all in one place has just really been impressive. So one of the concepts that was really interesting to me as someone who does work on Black teachers was this concept of abroad mentors. I've heard many teachers that I've been interviewed over the last few years talk about Woodson, but most of the teachers that I have interviewed taught between the years of 1950 and 1980. So of course, they didn't meet Woodson, right? But they did talk about Woodson's influence on them. They often talked about Woodson being this kind of mentor as if they knew Woodson, right? So to see Professor Givens develop this concept of abroad mentors has been very helpful to me in my own personal work. Professor Givens also talks about the influence of Woodson's book, The Education of the Negro Prior to 1861 and the Miseducation of the Negro, which, you know, in my work, teachers often mention these books, but they also mention another book called The History of the Negro Retold. And Professor Givens talks about the impact of these history books that Woodson produced on teachers. So it was just awesome to see all of this in one place and kind of reaffirm some of the work that we're doing with teachers in the movement. So I want to congratulate him for this incredible work. Professor Givens also discusses in detail the relationship that Woodson and Black teachers unions had on teachers. And one thing that I found very interesting and that Givens brings out in his work is that these Black teacher unions were more than just organizers of teachers. According to Professor Givens, you know, he helps us see these Black teachers unions as interlocutors with Black teachers. They were some of the first Black think tanks, so to speak. So that was really brought home to me in Professor Givens' work. And there was one statement that really helped bring it home for me. And that's when Professor Givens says, more than passive practitioners, Black school teachers were partners in the educational campaign that Woodson institutionalized. This statement resonated with me because some of the historiography on Black teachers promulgated primarily in the 1990s, some of their historiography tried to make the case that Black teachers were on the sidelines of social and educational activism. Some went as far as to say that Black teachers mostly maintained the status quo, not only in terms of their activism, but also in terms of their pedagogy and curriculum. So Professor Givens' concept of fugitive pedagogy offers a strong rebuttal to this master narrative and provides us with the language to discuss the pedagogy of Black teachers in a much more accurate way. So thank you for that, Professor Givens, and I'll turn it over now, back over to Dr. McDowell.
I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay. Our next panelist is Professor Pero Dagbovie, University Distinguished Professor in the Department of History and the Associate Dean in the Graduate School at Michigan State University. He is the editor of the Journal of African American History, the oldest and leading journal devoted to scholarship on African American history that was founded more than a century ago by the father of Black history, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Active in public history, Dagbovie has served as a scholar consultant for the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit and for the U.S. Department of the Interior, the National Park Service. He is currently serving as the lead historian for the restoration of the Carter G. Woodson Home National Historic Site in Washington, D.C. He has participated in and led numerous teaching history workshops and summer institutes for secondary school history teachers, supported by the U.S. Department of Education, the Michigan Department of Education, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The author of several book-length studies on Carter G. Woodson, his most recent book is Reclaiming the Black Past, the Use and Misuse of African American History in the 21st Century, a book I highly recommend. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dagbovie.
Thank you very much, Professor McDowell. And I am truly delighted to be participating on this panel for Jarvis Givens' new book. And once again, thank you, Professor McDowell, for inviting me to participate in this event, not only with Professor Givens, but also with two close friends of mine who have served as role models and mentors to me over the years, and that is Professor Wilson and Professor Alridge. I've known Jarvis since he was a graduate student, and I gotta say this, I'm getting old, but it's something I have to say, Jarvis, and it's been a pleasure watching you and witnessing you develop into being a leading scholar of your generation. It's also refreshing to see that you're carrying on the mantle of Carter G. Woodson in such a humble manner. So I really appreciate that about you, Jarvis. With Fugitive Pedagogy, Jarvis has contributed in meaningful ways to not only the historical scholarship on Woodson and the early Black history movement, but also to theorizing what he calls Black education at the level of experience and the art of teaching in the Black American experience during the first half of the 20th century. In Fugitive Pedagogy, Professor Givens situates his innovative interpretations of the educational experiences, work, philosophy, and world and influence of Carter Woodson to explore the notion of what he defines as fugitive pedagogy, Black history teaching and learning, Black teachers as political activists during the Jim Crow era, and the tradition of Black educational reform, struggle, and resistance. Central to Givens is the idea that fugitivity is, quote unquote, the meta-narrative of Black educational history. I'm not sure how he'd respond to this, but I think his book can be categorized as belonging to various subfields of historical inquiry, including social history, educational history, institutional history, and perhaps most importantly for me, intellectual history. After all, throughout the book, Givens seeks to understand, explain, and theorize what Woodson said, wrote, and did in the past. Givens' work is also part of the deeply rooted Black biographical tradition. That is, Fugitive Pedagogy can be read as constituting an intellectual biography of Woodson as a theorist and pragmatist that focuses on certain dimensions of his educational thought, philosophy, and legacy. Throughout the book, in order to historicize and make sense of his subject matter, Givens also coins and employs other terms, such as a broad mentorship, as Professor Alridge noted, shared vulnerability, curated public personas of respectability, Black educational criticism, and Woodson's rigorous sight, just to name a handful. In what follows in the next few minutes, I just want to talk about some dimensions of Given's book that resonated with me. In the opening chapter, Givens explores Woodson's life as a student and school teacher from his early years until the founding of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915. He reveals how Woodson's early education resembled that of many African Americans who were coming of age during the nadir of American race relations, while pinpointing how Woodson's experiences were distinctive. His discussions of more than a few subject matters are truly original, such as Woodson's relationship with his mother and uncles, his early encounter with a McGruffy reader, his own recollections of his educational past, and his experiences as a teacher and student in various settings, including his experiences in the Philippines under the auspices of the US War Department. Woodson biographers Sister Anthony Scally, Patricia Romero, and Jacqueline Goggin and others have unpacked Woodson's early years. Yet, Givens provides deeper interrogations into the potential meanings of his pre-World War I educational experiences. Givens creatively engages with many primary sources, as Professor Alridge noted, that previous scholars have underappreciated. Givens delves into how Woodson explicitly employed the association as a tool of, quote unquote, the subversive politics of Black education. He argues that the association was a purveyor of Black teacher education. He also showcases how Woodson served as a community educator while leading the association, and that this organization, more than anything else, was an embodiment of his overarching and evolving educational program. The influence that the association had as the quote unquote watchman on the wall becomes very clear in Givens' book. The Miseducation of the Negro is certainly Woodson's most popular publication. More than 500,000 copies of this broadside against highly educated Negroes have been sold to date. For many, this singular book has become his legacy. Givens offers a provocative reading of this polemic, namely by situating it as an expression of Black educational criticism and comparing Woodson's ideas with other African diasporic thinkers. He analyzes it as a decolonial text. Givens situates Woodson's famous textbook, The Negro in Our History, within the context of earlier Black textbooks published by non-professionally trained Black historians. Among the themes that he considers include portrayals of resistance, fugitivism. He skillfully places Woodson's textbook within the context of the race vindication tradition of Black history textbook writing. His assessment challenged me to reconsider Woodson's popular textbook that for years I've just simply viewed as being a dry, objective, and descriptive textbook, those that Woodson often wrote. Woodson's influence on and mentorship of Black school teachers is the subject of a compelling chapter. While much has been written about the role of the Negro History Bulletin as a platform for Black women school teachers and as a valuable resource during the educational reforms of the early Black history movement, Givens suggests that this magazine provided many school teachers throughout the nation with the tools to address the quote unquote fugitive demands of Black education. Givens dubs Woodson, as Professor Alridge noted, a broad mentor to Black teachers as professionals. That is, Woodson mentored countless Black school teachers remotely, long before this became something that we have all become all too familiar with during the COVID-19 pandemic. Gibson's overview of Black school teachers' collaboration with Woodson and involvement in the association and Negro History Week celebrations is really wonderful, especially based upon the archival sources that he draws upon. He basically makes this argument that Negro History Week wouldn't have been what it was if it wasn't for Black school teachers, which is the truth. I also found it very interesting that Givens looked at these Black school teachers associations in states like North Carolina, Oklahoma, Alabama, Missouri, Washington, DC, West Virginia, Louisiana, and elsewhere. Those places had these associations that definitely need to be probed into more, and Givens reminds us of that. Woodson's mass education movement targeted Black children and youth. Yet we rarely hear how children viewed the early Black history movement. Givens fills this void, exploring how Black students throughout the nation and in different classroom settings were potentially impacted by Woodson's expansive collection of curricular resources. These students' teachers employed Woodson's publications and the educational materials of the association to help transform Black youth's collective psyche and well-being and historical consciousness. I think that Givens is among the first scholars to in detail explore how Black students, based upon their own accounts and recollections, were impacted by Woodson's early Black history movement. The examples that he gives are thought-provoking, from the timely recollection of Congressman John Lewis to plays that students performed in. I agree with Givens that the student accounts are witnessing this critical notion of extending the historical transcript of Black education. Givens' work introduces new ways of analyzing modes of Woodsonian Black history education during the Jim Crow era segregation by employing a deliberately theoretical analysis, an analysis that challenges readers like myself to reframe how they might have thought about the early Black history movement, Black early teacher education, and Woodson's legacy. I don't really have any expertise in the history of African American education, so the framing of this study was new to me. From the early 1990s until the first decade of the 21st century, Jacqueline Goggins' 1993 biography on the father of Black history was considered by many to be the authoritative work on Woodson. Now, during the last several decades, more than a few monographs have expanded upon Goggins' study. Givens' knowledge to me is clearly on par with the leading scholars of Woodson and the early Black history movement. In particular, I think his book will help inform African-American educational historians, Black studies practitioners, particularly those hailing from Gen Y and Gen Z. Givens has sought to leave no stone unturned in terms of locating primary sources. Several pieces of historical evidence that he discovered are worth noting. He tracked down a brief autobiographical account that Woodson authored, a document that I have not seen yet. Reminder, Jarvis, please send me an email with that document. He also located a photo of a young Woodson at Douglas School in Huntington, West Virginia in 1896. This is a major find. I had never seen this picture before, I'm embarrassed to confess. The national and international membership list for 1928 that he found in the papers, I think at Emory, raises many questions and opens doors to future scholars' interrogations. You know, we learned that there are branches that have more than 100 members in places like Missouri, New York, Pennsylvania, DC. These branches need to be explored more. For someone who's been studying Woodson for several decades now, Jarvis's book for me was a page turner. Though I might not use the same terminology that he employs to describe Woodson's educational outlook and program and legacy, I really do appreciate and respect his interpretations. They really challenged me to rethink how I've thought about things for some time. Unlike W.B. Du Bois, Woodson was not a complex theorist. He actually frowned upon abstract theorization. You know, this does not mean, however, that his work can't be theorized, okay? After all, this is what Jarvis does, and this is one of the greatest strengths of his work. He translates Woodson's educational ideologies for a 21st century audience and readership who can at best imagine what Woodson and his contemporaries experienced. So let me just close by saying that Givens effectively employs Woodson as a looming protagonist to explore key characteristics of Black teaching and educational reform efforts during the first half of the 20th century. His work is simply more than an account of a major Black leader. He really adeptly places Woodson, the association, and Woodson's co-workers within numerous contexts. He points out how this leader evolved and changed during his life. He reveals how Woodson interacted with others and can be compared with others. He avoids the pitfalls of hagiography. He addresses the American Historical Association's 5 C's of historical thinking, and he strives to disentangle why Woodson and other subjects thought and acted in the way that he did. The final word on Woodson hasn't been written, of course. We don't really have a definitive biography on Woodson. To quote from Arnold Rampersad, definitive biographies don't exist. But one thing I think certainly is certain, at least for me, is that future historians and scholars who are going to be dealing with the Black history movement and Carter Woodson and the teaching of Black history during the era of Jim Crow segregation would best use Givens's book as some type of starting point. They should be compelled to read his work. So thank you, Jarvis, Professor Givens, for writing this really excellent book and for continuing the tradition of Woodson in many different ways. I'm sure that he would say that you were one of those who was willing to sacrifice for the cause. So you have so much to be proud of. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much to be proud of. Thank you, Professor Dagbovie. As we are wont to say, last but certainly not least is Francio Wilson. Professor Wilson is an intellectual and labor historian whose research examines the intersections between Black labor movements, Black social scientists, and Black women's history during the Jim Crow era. She is Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, History, and Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Southern California, and served as interim chair of Gender and Sexuality Studies for 2 terms in 2020. She will become the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Black Studies in May 2021. Forgive if that is a mispronunciation. Great news here, another cause for celebration. She is the co-curator of Rise Up LA, a century of votes for women at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, on view from April 1st, 2021 to October 10th, 2021. She was one of 6 scholars chosen by the Archivists of the United States to serve on the Historians Advisory Panel for the National Archives 2019 to 2021 exhibit, Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote. Wilson was the National Director of the Association of Black Women Historians from 2015 to 2018. She was also a 2017-18 fellow at the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Her book, The Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists and the Creation of Black Labor Studies, 1890 to 1950, was awarded the 2007 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize for the best book in Black women's history. Wilson earned a PhD in American history from the University of Pennsylvania, and an MAT in social studies from Harvard, and a BA in political science from Wellesley College. Please join me in welcoming my friend and great scholar, Francio Wilson.
Thank you so much. And this is the problem of having a name that ends in W. So I'm following really fantastic comments by Professor Dagbovie and Professor Alridge, as well as Professor Givens's wonderful introduction to his book that I hope everyone will read. One of the things that I want to say about his book is that if you know anything about African-American history, you are just going to, it's going to make your mind explode, because they're both things you didn't know that are really interesting. They're things that you thought you knew, that he persuades you didn't really know, or you only thought you knew what it was. The theorization is amazing. I think that this book is going to lead to so many new studies, particularly studies, as Professor Dagbovie said, of Black Teachers Associations, studies of the ways that Black history was actually taught in schools. This is one of the really useful things that I think he's done, and people that are historians or any kind of scholars realize how much archival work he had to do to get even the smallest little vignettes. You know, how did he find those? Where did he get those photographs? And you know, the video of Woodson, you know, like you can actually see him. And so I want to politely disagree with Professor Dagbovie's comment that Woodson wasn't a complex theorist. I think that Woodson is really underestimated as a theorist, and I think that Professor Givens has demonstrated this by not just by creating a theory, but I think as Elsa Barkley Brown has argued about Magdalena Walker, I think his theory is in his actions. And so we can see him as a complex theorist of, you know, how to get Black people to actually embody their own history. And, you know, when it just his, I was in that generation that was maybe the next to the last. I don't know if we were the last generation to start our education in segregated schools. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about Marthenia Bates Johnson and the other teachers that taught us about something about history, but also taught us about how much they loved us and pressed our hair before we had to perform in front of the white administrator, Ferdinand Del Pino, who was clearly an idiot, but we had to, you know, impress him with our various presentations and the things we memorized, the ways that our parents and the teachers all came together at New Lincoln School, which my father had also attended. In reading the book and having grown up just outside St. Louis, my parents were taught by Lorenzo Green at Lincoln University. So I started thinking about all those generations. My husband went to Lucretia Mott Elementary School in DC, and John Bracey actually was one of his babysitters. And so it made me think about what it was like to go to that school. And I hope somebody will write about those teachers. The principal, Maud K. Brown, my husband still talks about him. Recently, he talked to one of his teachers who was turning 100. So, you know, I think for me, personally, Givens gave a picture of what it was like to be a student at one of these segregated schools. And I lived across the street from the white school. So I was very aware that they had buses. We didn't have buses. We only got our books when their books were, when they finished their books. So our books had like 20 names in them, you know, they were real old. So I think that getting this idea about the dialectic, the way that teachers had to give us this information, is really important. I was also thinking about the fact that I know from John Bracey's discussions at ASALH, I still have a problem calling it ASALH because I grew up with it being the association, as if there were no other associations. That Bracey's junior high school teacher was Albert Brooks, who of course, careful readers know is the father of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. And so, you know, the way that African-American history and teachers continue into the Black Studies movement is, you know, I would suggest Jarvis could be your next book because there's so many links. When you talked about John Cromwell, I thought about his granddaughter, Adelaide Cromwell, who founded Boston University's African American Studies program and was one of the first Black teachers at Smith and Hunter. But so many of the people you talked about, as you really so brilliantly discussed, like Woodson, started their careers as high school, junior high school, even elementary teachers. And so, you know, and my brother-in-law was taught in high school by Evelyn Higginbotham, you know, so it didn't end with segregation, you know, the practice of starting to teach. I initially planned to be a high school or a junior high school teacher. And, you know, my son just got an MAT last year and is starting that career. And, you know, he's surrounded by books of, you know, this is a book in my own library, Negro Makers of History by Woodson. And it was actually his great-grandfather's book that has come down to me. And, you know, the ways that Woodson, I would say that it was part of Woodson's intellectual strategy to get school teachers. You give the names of one of many school teachers that publish books through the Associated Publishers. I've got another one, The Child's History of the Negro by James Shackelford, who's a Black teacher in Ohio. And this is a book that I inherited from my parents. So I think that, you know, you have done just such an amazing job giving us a vivid portrayal of how over several generations, Woodson helped to spur and give the actual materials to Black teachers to be able to teach African American history. And they didn't just depend on Woodson, they went out and did their own work. And he was assisted by really able people that he called his boys, you know, and they would, years later at the association meetings, they would talk about Woodson and they would give these anecdotes and you would say, well, Woodson was always firing them and then calling them up and saying, why didn't you come back to work? I find a lot of humor in Woodson's books. He's a very sly humorist, you know, like in The Miseducation, where he says, you know, where he critiques interracial cooperation and he says, you know, Black people were coing and while white people were operating. And, you know, that's just funny. I mean, as well as very insightful. And he calls Black people that he feels are, you know, promoting the American school, promoting what we today would call racial capitalism. He calls them assistant oppressors. Assistant oppressors. What are you talking about? And yet he tells us that at 19th Street Baptist Church, that's the church of Nannie Helen Burroughs. Nannie Helen Burroughs, right, has a funny play about Black churches that people are still performing in the 21st century. She was Woodson's co-conspirator in the work of African American history. And I just want to finish by saying two things. One, when the Woodson Center, when the Woodson Institute began, Armstead Robinson called the living people who had worked with Woodson together: Charles Harris Wesley, Lorenzo J. Green, Benjamin Quarles, Dorothy Porter Wesley, all came to Charlottesville to do this project. And I was working on my dissertation, and I asked them, how could you put up with him? Because then they gave a lot of anecdotes. And they always said the cause was greater than the man. And even though they admired Woodson, it was this cause of Black history. And I think that, you know, calling it the plot is very instructive, and an idea that I hadn't really gotten. I think your theorization and your intellectual history is important. The association has long had, first they had panels about that were like, I remember Carter G. Woodson, and as this has gone on well into the 21st century, even as fewer people had that direct memory of him. But we would hear from, in the 21st century, from John Hope Franklin and Dorothy Height and other people that were directly, and you bring these people up. My first introduction to Woodson, the idea of Woodson was at my very first association meeting in New York in the late 70s. And John W. Davis was leading one of these Woodson memory panels. And he told a story. He said Woodson was married to the association. But perhaps, I mean, today maybe I would think that he was trying to make sure we understood that Woodson, a bachelor, was not gay. You know, he said that one time Woodson was introducing himself to a lady, and the woman said, "Of course you know me. You asked me to marry you one time." You know, like the idea that Woodson was completely engaged in the building of the association and the building of African American history. But more fundamentally, Woodson, when Davis said Woodson, when Woodson was asked to be president of West Virginia State, he told the people, get yourself a lesser man. And so this is after Woodson had been fired from Howard and therefore had no job and really needed a job. He became dean, and John W. Davis became the president. So Davis was telling this story on himself. He was the quote unquote lesser man. And so I do think that whether that was an apocryphal story that Davis was telling on himself, the way the association worked post Woodson was to create, as you've argued, a fugitive pedagogy about not just Woodson, but about the need for African American history, a history that was robust, that was diasporic, as you clearly indicate, and that was rigorous. And I really thank you for this book. I'll be rereading it, and look forward to teaching it in graduate and undergraduate courses.
Thank you. I feel so appreciative to hear these full comments, but also the anecdotes and personal narratives about the kind of family ties and connections to the story is really one of the things. I feel like I'm jumping ahead. I know Derrick is supposed to jump in here, but those kind of narratives and stories that I got from people when I first started going to Asala is really what motivated me to try to pursue the voices of Black students and people who had been personally impacted by this tradition, really, that I was trying to kind of, take care to really pull apart and really open up for us to understand and to study in the book. I wanted to make sure that I was able to get those elements of the things that I heard and experienced in the the anecdotes and the stories that people shared about these things in the book. And so I really appreciate you sharing both the personal narrative, but also pointing to that element of the text.
Well, thank you. This has been very lively, and kudos to Professors Wilson and Dagbovie for their outstanding remarks, and Professor Givens, congrats to you again. But I want to turn it over now to Professor McDowell, who has a question. I'd like to start with her.
Oh, thank you, Derrick. Once again, I want to thank Jarvis Givens for providing us a magnificent book, which I predict we'll be reading, rereading, and studying for some years to come. My question is a simple one, and it concerns one of the subtle strategies or leitmotifs or images of the book. The continual reference to what you refer to as the American school. Now, you are talking about pedagogy, you're talking about education, but if I may suggest, it is clear that, and this is so clever, that school here has much more expansive permutations than the surface might suggest. So I'd like to have you talk a bit more about your choice of that concept, the American school.
Yes, thank you for that question. And it's funny you should bring that up, because I got into trouble with that concept in some of the reader reports but for me, I feel like Woodson and many these Black educators that I was writing about in the book had a very expansive idea of the way miseducation functioned in society, and what constituted meaningful education, but also what constituted the various elements of the kind of oppressive forms of education in society. And I wanted to talk about that because Woodson wasn't just thinking about the distortion of Black life in curriculum, in the formal curriculum of schools. He also was thinking about, the way in which Black life is represented in things like, for instance, when we think about the founding of the association, at the meetings leading up to the founding of the association in 1915, Woodson was actively discussing Birth of a Nation and the way in which Black life was distorted in that film and what that represented in the kind of popular imagination, the way in which Black life was distorted, and that there was a relationship between all of these things, right? But even for me, drawing on the theories of people like, Althusser, who writes about the ideological state apparatus and the ways that, schools are a part of a larger extension of the state, where dominant ideology and the ideas that are in service to the kind of ruling class function and are transmitted through formal structures of schooling, but they're also tied to other forms of educational practices and institutions that shape society. And Woodson was aware of that. All of these educators were aware of that. And I felt like I needed to name that as the kind of the larger structure of schooling that's embodied in brick and mortar institutions, but that also exceed those spaces as well. And likewise, Woodson's efforts to challenge miseducation, didn't only take place in the context of brick and mortar schools, right? It was also through student groups that were being created. Like, I think about this group of Black students in San Diego in the 1930s that created an organization called the Woodsonians at San Diego State, right? Where they were creating these out-of-school study spaces. And you see examples like that all over the place, right? And so for me, it was important to think expansively about what constituted education in terms of the kind of constraint and oppressive forms, but also in the ways in which Black folks work to resist these structures of domination in terms of schooling.
Good. Thank you. So I have a question. We've talked a lot about the amount of research you did, and I just would just like to know, how did you locate the teachers who were in contact with Woodson, and You know, you work those archives with the Black Teachers Associations, and by the way, I called them unions earlier, so please forgive me, but to what extent did you engage those sources, those teacher association papers to help you make the connection between Woodson and teachers, Black teachers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say, it's something that I started to realize was more important toward the end after I was finishing the dissertation. You know, Woodson's papers, there are a few teachers that come up in his personal papers where there'll be letters between Woodson and these educators. But I come across a recording of Jerry Moore, who was the student of Tessie McGee, who recalled this, you know, Tessie McGee secretly reading from Woodson's textbook. And then I was able to find more information about Tessie McGee and the school. Jerry Moore had given this account in another interview years prior. But then I found a newspaper article that said that the principal of that school was actually a presidential candidate for the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association. And I thought, well, perhaps the way that I can locate Woodson in the story of teachers is by going through these networks and these organizations that I know Woodson is aware of, because he writes about his own teachers being one of the founders of the organizations in West Virginia, right? And his essay on the history of education in West Virginia. So I know that he's aware of this. And then I started to look more into it, and I started to see, oh, Woodson also mentions these teacher associations in some of his own newspaper articles. And so I started to seek out the records of colored teacher associations to search for Woodson in those records as a way to make the case about the relationship between them, because Woodson's papers didn't necessarily have a full accounting of this kind of expansive and broad reach of the organization. And I just started to do that, make it a practice, to identify notable teachers in various different states that I knew were active in these state teacher associations, to see if they had papers, whether it's at the Amistad Research Center, at the Schomburg, at various different places in archives across the country, and look in their personal papers. And sure enough, there are correspondences with Woodson, there are correspondences from the association, and then also their journals, their monthly and quarterly publications. Just go to the month January through March. Black History Month comes up annually in all of these newspaper publications. Sometimes there are even excerpts of speeches from Woodson giving the keynote address at their annual meetings, right? So that started to become a strategy for me to try to pull out the story of these ordinary teachers to give more shape to the narrative. I didn't want it. It's not that I wanted to decenter Woodson in the story, but I understood the story to be about more than just him as an individual person, but to be more about a tradition that Woodson inherited and expanded on, and that's really embodied in the work that all of these educators were doing around the country.
Thank you, brilliant. How did the Brown versus Board of Education decision and later desegregation impact fugitive pedagogy?
I think the short answer, one of the quick answers that I think that immediately comes to mind for that is, it really leads to the dismantling of this networked world that Black teachers had created for more than a century. So that's really one of the unfortunate or tragic aspects of this narrative, is that these very teachers, who actually are the people who were in the shadows and really responsible for achieving Brown v. Board of Education, right? Vanessa Siddle Walker's work teaches us that we can't just think about the lawyers in the courtroom. We have to think about the teachers who were secretly funneling the money to the NAACP to actually fund the litigation efforts, and who are actually recruiting the plaintiffs in the South for these Northern lawyers to actually go and actually, push the cause forward, right? Is that these are the teachers who are organizing in the shadows to do this and intentionally keeping themselves out of sight, because we know places like Mississippi, South Carolina, and the list goes on, made it illegal for educators to actually be members of the NAACP. This is why we know why Septima Clark is fired. But the tragedy is that even as Black educators are responsible for trying to push for justice and equality in the context of education and educational policy, what comes after is, in terms of the way that Brown v. Board is implemented, they end up kind of dismantling many of the institutions that were their advocacy organizations to actually act on their behalf, right? And so when these teacher associations merged with the teacher associations that had formerly, upheld Jim Crow segregation in the South, and who were the people who were invested in suppressing Black education, unfortunately, that entire network and that pedagogical structure and model gets undermined in the process.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question related here to Black studies. Professor Givens, where would you situate Woodson within the broader history of the Black studies enterprise?
I would say that Woodson and what Woodson built represents the institutional precursor to what we know as Black studies today. There is no other single organization outside of ASALH and Negro History Week and the Journal of Negro History that Woodson created that represents a kind of sustained institutional space that incubated a kind of Black studies in the way that it was formalized in these organizations also, but that created, what Alden Morris calls an insurgent intellectual network, right? But also created space for mentorship and things like that to happen, that I think comes out beautifully in Professor Wilson's work in terms of this kind of early, these kind of generations of scholars that start to build on one another and the relationships that are formed between them. The institutional space that Woodson creates is really the institutional forerunner for what becomes Black studies when it's implanted in the American university in the late 60s. And I say that to say, it's not just Woodson on his own, but I think he really he becomes the person that's well positioned to kind of institutionalize something that Black teachers had already been doing, to be clear. And I try to make that point, clear in the book. Before Woodson goes to Chicago to found the ASALH in 1915, the Black teachers in DC are hosting professional development seminars where they're bringing Du Bois to give lectures on sketches of Negro history and how to rethink teaching civics and social studies and literature in their classes. And they are, they're doing this as, in the months leading up to Woodson actually going off and founding the association. And we know that there are other examples of this, before 1915 as well. But I think Woodson is positioned because I do think some of the social capital that he has as a Black PhD from Harvard, even as he's not good enough to be in the kind of white universities, it does allow him to forge some partnerships that can kind of establish the institution that he creates within the first couple of decades of ASALH's history. Oh, by the 1930s, we know that his relationship with white funders would be strained, and he would then have to rely primarily on Black folks to give a larger number of smaller donations to sustain the organization. But I would say that he represents the prehistory to Black studies, and the teachers that are a part of this organization are the people who are responsible for transmitting the Black studies tradition that becomes implanted in the university in the late 1960s. And I think, and Professor Dagbovie has an article when he uses the language of the kind of the early Black studies movement as opposed to the early Black history movement. And I like his formulation in that article a lot because I think it speaks to this question that you're asking.
Yes, yes. I want to thank you, Professor Givens. I want to encourage the audience to ask Professor Givens some questions. It's not often we have the opportunity to engage a young scholar or a scholar of his magnitude with in this way. So please ask questions. At this point, I want to ask Professor McDowell to pose a question.
Okay, but only if there isn't one already loaded, all right? Because I have so many questions about this book, but let's follow up on this one concerning Black studies. Fugitive Pedagogy, you're drawing on Harney and Moten and the concept of the undercommons. And if I can interrupt myself, I just want to also commend you on the range of reference in this book. When you begin one chapter saying blank, blank, blank was spiteful, I said, oh my goodness, he's been reading Toni Morrison. but that's just one example of the range of reference and the impressive interlocutors that are arrayed in this book. So I want to commend you on that. But the question has to do with the idea of fugitivity, the undercommons, et cetera. In the university, I appreciate your distinguishing between Black studies as something that far precedes its institutionalization in US academies of higher learning. All right, I appreciate that you don't, the origin story is not in the late 1960s. So I think that's very important. But how do we talk about these concepts within the context of a neoliberal university, within the context where we have Black students, not all Black students, but many Black students for whom Black study is something to be avoided, right? For whom Black study is it's not a legitimate mode of inquiry, or Black study is not the path to idea of success, or their notions of success. This is long-winded, but I'm sure other educators on the panel may have examples of being actually asked by parents, why should my child do this? All right, what is this going to get him? So it's a long-winded question about the project, Woodson's project, your new interpretation of it in relation to these utilitarian notions of contemporary education in the neoliberal academy. Long-winded.
Yeah, no, but there's a lot to talk about there. But I must say, I'm so happy that you pulled out that line that's thinking or kind of riffing on Toni Morrison in the second chapter. I appreciate you for catching that.
Yes, I did.
And I would say that, so yes, in terms of the language of fugitivity, one of the things that was important for me was to, one, disrupt this idea that Black study, because in large part, the undercommons is kind of thinking about Black study as something kind of emerging in the undercommons of the white American university. And I wanted to, one, offer a kind of a historically grounded perspective on what it means to think about fugitivity and Black study as something that extends much earlier than that, and to make sure that we place Black teachers in that conversation. But also, I think one of the things that's interesting is that the kind of contemporary iterations of language, the language and discussion of fugitivity is oftentimes always an anti-institutional kind of perspective, when in fact, one of the things that we see is that we actually see Black folks and educators casting an institutional vision, but it's one with Black folks and Black people's best interests in mind, right? So there's no way to kind of read this early kind of narrative in a fugitive pedagogy and think of it completely in an anti-institutional way, because, you know, fugitive slaves and the freed people, one of the first things that they're doing after emancipation is to build schools and to build institutions that other people are trying to suppress, right? I know that you referenced the citation about between 1864 and 1876, over 630 Black schools, institutions were burned down, right? So I wanted to think about this more malleable perspective of what Black fugitive life means, because it's not always only a kind of an anti-institutional perspective, right? Because we actually need to do things like sustain Black institutions like ASALH, right? And like other important organizations that we have that have been so central to preserving and transmitting the traditions that we continue to need to think with and to build with. I would say to this kind of the neoliberal university and this utilitarian approach to thinking about education, I think this, Woodson would say, this is a matter of miseducation, right? We have to think about what do we understand the higher aims and the moral demands of education to be? And if we're not leading with those questions, then there's no way for us to understand why a project like Black Studies would be useful and important for shaping the kind of people that we are interested in and having in the world to try to imagine something different than what we currently have, right? But that also means that Black studies has to be intentional about how it casts its own vision and how it disseminates that vision to help and to make sure that people understand how Black studies is intentionally set apart from these the typical logics and protocols of the neoliberal university. Yeah, so those are some pieces of what I would try to offer based on what you asked, because it's a very rich question. But yeah.
Great response.
Thank you. Professor Dagbovie has a question.
Sure. Building upon the notion of Carter G. Woodson as a pragmatist, and in response to your conclusion, Jarvis, what do you think the role of African American, in particular, K through 12 teachers and educators are in the larger modern Black studies movement or enterprise?
Yeah, you know, it's really, I've yet to see a really robust program in any Black study. I'm sure perhaps I'm overlooking one, but it's really unfortunate that we see nothing close to the kind of partnerships between Black scholars in the academy and K through 12 educators that we see in the model that Woodson and these organizations that come out in this book had. I see nothing like it in the contemporary moment. And I think that that's in some ways a call to action for Black studies programs everywhere to consider how are we accounting for and thinking about the larger vision of our work that extends beyond the university. And beyond the university should obviously mean, you know, accounting for thinking about students in elementary, middle school, and high school that then become our students in the university, so that we don't have to always start at ground zero and people saying, I've never heard who Carter G. Woodson was or who Du Bois was, right? That's absolutely a demand that Black studies, that's placed on Black studies and its mission that we need to reconsider in the current moment. But unfortunately, intentional partnerships with K through 12 educators doesn't seem like it's been a priority in the field of Black studies, you know, writ large. And you'd be hard pressed to find a department, a Black studies department that has an intentional strategy around that. And I think that that's something that should change.
Let me just jump in there. I am a member of the a commission on African American history education in the Commonwealth. And moving forward in the Commonwealth of Virginia, anyone who's getting a teacher certification will need a course or some kind of professional development in African American history or studies. And that's also a requirement for people who are getting their licenses renewed. So there are great opportunities for more collaboration. And I'm happy to say that Professor McDowell and I talk about this often. And so we're hoping that this conversation can happen across the country. So we have another question from a professor I think you may know, Professor Givens. Her name is Professor Eula Taylor. And she wants to know, your book is an interdisciplinary work. How might it be different if you were educated exclusively in a history department or education department? Very interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if there probably wouldn't be the same breadth of sources and interpretive resources that I intentionally draw on in the book, whether that be Toni Morrison, and in the way Toni Morrison talks about the limits of, I opened the book thinking about the importance of language, right? And when Sixo says if a language, he stopped speaking English because he saw no future in the language, right? So thinking with, Black African-American literature, thinking with scholars in performance study, who've done important work in terms of Black performance, really informed the way I even approached interacting with archival material. I learned a lot from what it meant to name things that are not explicitly in documents, but that are there because of what we can infer from the kind of human interactions and scenarios that are being kind of represented in the materials. And so being able to build and piece together a set of interpretive resources to apply both to the archive, but also in terms of how I imagined the work contributing to the world and to a diverse group of scholars that are not just academics in history or in schools of education, but also people who are thinking about community education work, and people who are, I think African American studies allowed me to search for the things that I needed in order to approach the question most rigorously. And obviously that requires some discipline. I still had to ground it in thinking in a disciplined way about archives, and I didn't want it to be too abstract and not grounded and accountable to any research methods. But being trained in an African American Studies department where I had access to this broad range of intellectual resources that reflect the dynamism of Black life that I'm trying to write about and to represent, I think was really freeing in many ways. And also having, excellent mentors who are not wedded to disciplinary decadence, right? To borrow from Lewis Gordon, right? Folks like Professor Taylor, who said, yeah, it's important to think about the way in which, things that can't be documented in the historical archives might be represented when it's rendered at the level of the Black literary imagination. It might be important to think across these mediums in some ways, as I'm trying to access important elements of the story, right? And so it was very enriching to be in a space that allowed me to think in that way and to be a little more nimble in how I approached asking questions and trying to seek out answers to questions.
Excellent. Professor Wilson?
I just wanted to ask Professor Givens to talk a little bit more about his engagement and argument about Woodson's diasporic tendencies, and especially the ways that diasporic actors like Aimé Césaire, but particularly Sylvia Wynter, seem to engage in the same kind of fugitive pedagogy that Woodson does. I think it really helps make your case. And, it made me think about how Woodson is often criticized as a contributionist, something that August Meyer really tried to pin on him as a negative, and somebody who wasn't diasporic. And I think you make the case, and as does Professor Dagbovie and many others, that he really is diasporic. And, when you were saying, I hadn't realized that he had taught Rayford Logan. But of course, Rayford Logan's work was on French colonialism. And so Woodson so I want to understand better how you got the idea to link, how you found out about Sylvia Wynter's engagement with Woodson, and how you began to link other intellectuals from outside of the US.
Right, thank you for that. And part of it is building on the previous question that in Black studies, we have to read a range of materials, whether that be literature, whether that be theorists and literary criticism, and folks like, Hortense Spillers and Sylvia Wynter. But when I came across Sylvia Wynter's essay that she wrote in response to the beating of Rodney King, No Humans Involved, and I saw the kind of consistent citations of Woodson 1933, Woodson 1933, Woodson 1933 throughout that manuscript, obviously her referencing the miseducation of the Negro. And then I, started to become really interested in how Wynter, this very, very important theorist in Black studies, was engaging with Carter G. Woodson's ideas, someone who many people don't think of as a theorist, right? And I do think that I started to, so I guess that was one of the approaches that I wanted to identify in terms of why Sylvia Wynter was important, but also because Sylvia Wynter, being a diasporic thinker, she also contextualizes Woodson's contributions in that way, because Woodson always understands the distortion of Black life in the US as inextricably linked to the distortions of how Africa is represented in the canons of knowledge and historical scholarship, so on and so forth. Woodson always understands there to be a relationship between those two, but also encountering letters between Woodson and people like Casey Hayford, right, who was an important Pan-Africanist who was exchanging letters with Woodson early on about the work that he's doing with the association. And then also Woodson's critique of educational efforts on the African continent are the same critiques that he's making of the manipulation of Black education in the context of the US. So Woodson's awareness of the relationship between white philanthropy and the miseducation of Black folks in the US South, but also on in sub-Saharan Africa, and the way he's very public about it. He writes searing critiques of Thomas Jesse Jones' report on education in Africa. And in the miseducation of the Negro, he doesn't go in depth into that, but he does gesture towards it at a number of times in terms of Black education on both sides of the Atlantic in that particular text. But when we go and read his critiques of things like education in Africa or African heroes and heroines, that book that he writes as a textbook for middle school aged students, it's very clear that he's thinking diasporically about these questions around Black education and Black life.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and the question is as follows. Do you see any unique pedagogical practices of Black women as teachers versus that of Black male teachers? I am wondering about a Black feminist pedagogy within the context of fugitive pedagogy.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'm trying to think about how I would approach that question, because one of the things, I mean, it's very obvious that so many of the teachers that appear are Black women in the story. And I think in some ways, you know, the kind of the kinship elements to the way that teachers and students in the context of these schools are understood as relating to one another. I do think, and I don't want, sometimes I don't like to rely too heavily on thinking about the way that these, even when students talk about the fact that they saw their teachers as an extension of their families, right? I do think that there are ways in which gender roles did come into play in terms of how students related to one another and the kinds of relational dynamics that took form in the context of these schools. I would need to think more about that to give a fuller answer about how we make, about how I would go about approaching thinking about a feminist pedagogy layered in fugitive pedagogy, because I think that so much about fugitive pedagogy is a lot of it is modeled on the work that Black women were doing, right? Even the way that I'm thinking about this kind of performing compliance, but actually subverting the kind of structures of power that are in play in the school, that's something that a lot of feminist scholars talk about. I draw heavily on Zora Neale Hurston to think about that and to name that, right? And I don't, it appears with these Black women teachers, and perhaps it appears in a certain way that's distinct from the Black male teachers, but I would have to think more deeply about the gendered distinctions of that, because I don't have an exact answer to that right now, other than the fact that I think, you know, it's consistent with a lot of feminist scholarship about how Black women have navigated power in hostile institutional contexts. And I think that many of those elements of understanding that we get from Black feminist scholars have really shaped the way that I was analyzing the power dynamics of Black folks in these schools to begin with. So in some ways, I feel like the way that I want to approach theorizing the fugitive pedagogy drew so heavily on Black women scholars and Black women scholarship, right? Even I'm thinking about, you know, gender and Jim Crow, right? Black women teachers as double agents. That was one of the first things that really came to my mind to think about how Black educators as a professional class started to embody a particular approach to navigating power. And I'm sure there's some more ways to tease that out that are particular to Black women, but I think that so many Black women were influential in shaping this practice to begin with. It's hard for me to pull that apart.
Thank you. Let me just say it's been an honor to moderate this intellectually engaging panel. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Professor McDowell.
Thank you, Derrick. Thank you, all of you. We have run just slightly over, and I'm sure you agree with me that we could continue, but all good things must come to an end. Once again, thank you so much, Jarvis Givens, for giving us such a powerful book. Thanks to the panelists, Professor Alridge, Dagbovie, and Wilson for your trenchant remarks. In the fall of the year, we will begin celebrating the Woodson Institute's 40th anniversary. And it is good to be discussing this book as we anticipate moving into the next era of an institution that was clearly born in conflict and has survived opposition from various directions. We are still here, however. Wishing you all a wonderful weekend. Don't forget to take advantage of the Harvard University discount and order this book. Be well until the next time. Bye now.
Thank you so much.